I think we've got everyone out of the waiting room so far. So thank you all for being here with us today. This is our last webinar of this year, but we do have more coming in 2024. So continue to look out for information about those, the continuation of our AIHEC Health webinar series. We are very excited to welcome today Dr. Suzanne Stewart is here. A huge welcome to Dr. Suzanne Stewart. Dr. Stewart is a member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. She is a registered psychologist and director of the Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, where she is a professor in the Division of Social and Behavioral Health Sciences. She holds the TC Energy Research Chair in Indigenous Health. Research and teaching interests include Indigenous health and healing and psychology, homelessness, youth mental health, identity and work-life development, Indigenous determinants of health, Indigenous pedagogies in higher education and health sciences, and Indigenous research ethics and methodologies. She is committed to advancing Indigenous healing issues in academics, health practice, and policy. So a huge thank you and welcome to Dr. Suzanne Stewart.
Oh, thank you, Massey Cho. It's great to be here. And since we're a small group, I would really, I feel like it would be better processing for what we're going to talk about today if everyone was able to give a brief introduction and maybe just, say who you are and where you're from and why you wanted to come to this today. So that'd be great. So I could just start. Well, Maggie kindly introduced me. So I'm Suzanne and I'm Dene Eagle Clan. And I'm really excited to be here. And I love connecting with my, Indigenous brothers and sisters in the US, because I feel like we're really stronger together. So that's why I wanted to come and do this with all of you today. So Massey Cho, so I'm going to pass it to David.
Hi, thank you, everybody. It's so wonderful. Can't wait to hear from you, Suzanne. So David Clark, I'm out here in California from a company called, Praxis AI. We built the AustNet Virtual Institute. And so we have this online platform that we use for the delivery of great programming like yours to tribal colleges and universities across the country. And we also help with the editing of the videos and posting them to the digital libraries. So I'm interested in taking all your wonderful words and getting them out there. I will pass it on to Cynthia.
It'll take me a little while to unmute. Thank you all. My name is Cynthia Sanders, and I'm with the College in the Muskogee Nation. I'm actually a science instructor, and I'm just interested in finding out what information is available towards this venue. Thank you.
Who are you going to pass it to, Cynthia?
I will pass it to Kay DePalma.
Hello, I'm Kathy DePalma. I'm actually work for AIHEC. I was the grants administrator, and now I've moved into programs. I have an interest in this topic, mental health in general, and so I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Hi, David.
Hi, Kathy. Great to see you again.
Great to see you. And I'm going to pass it to Miss Reno. Who is muted? There you go.
I'm Reno Charette, and I'm the Director of Health Initiatives. Wounded today with foot surgery, so it's
sorry,
living with daily pain. But I'm interested in your topic, Suzanne, so that I can learn more about how to help tribal college students who want to go into the mental health field and how they might do research. So this is a learning opportunity for the staff as well as for our students and our partners. And I will pass it to Eric Johnson.
Hi, Suzanne. Eric Johnson. I'm also part of the Health Initiatives team as a contractor. And like Reno mentioned, of course, AIHEC and our Health Initiatives team works with lots of tribal college students. And mental health is, of course, a hot topic among youth and students today. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to share, and hopefully can archive this video so more than just those that are in attendance today will be able to take advantage of your wisdom. And I'll pass it to Madison.
All right, hello. I'm Madison. I'm actually at the University of Michigan in the College of Pharmacy. I'm not a pharmacist, but I do work with students, and we partner with some of the tribal colleges within the state of Michigan. And so while we are in pharmacy, we try to make sure that all of our students have a wide view of health in general and a holistic view. So I'm always interested in these webinars and being able to go into the teachings with that knowledge. And I think all that is left is Dakota.
So Dakota sent me a message, or maybe it's in the chat, that she's allowed to unmute or start video. So I don't know what to do about that. But I can tell you a little bit from the registration potentially. Dakota is a TCU student at I don't know where, Bay Mills Community College. So we have a TCU student here with us. And Dakota, I apologize that I don't know why you can't unmute or turn your video on. But thank you for being here. Oh, great. And Eric Johnson shared that she is in the Dene Institute, which is one of our other initiatives at AIHEC with the Health Initiatives team. So
yay.
Thank you.
Great job, Dakota.
And I'll go really quick. I'm Maggie. I am with the AIHEC Health Initiatives team also. I just generally, similar to Kathy, I'm interested in the whole, and then with my job influence, indigenizing mental health and understanding the impacts of colonialization and how to support our TCU students in a way that's impactful, and then maybe encourage them to move into health-related research and careers in the future. Oh, and
Dakota just left a really nice message in the chat.
Yeah, so Bay Mills Community College, currently live in Texas, and I care about mental health because of the rise in Native American suicides. I want to start caring about mental health at an early age instead of waiting until it's a problem. So wonderful. And her degree.
Amazing.
Wonderful. And she has a degree in ECE. I don't know what that is.
Early childhood education.
Ah, there we go. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your introductions. I love it when we can do that, because then we can begin to form a relationship among all of us during this time, because the relationship is really what the foundation of teaching and learning is, from an Indigenous knowledges perspective. So yes, we're here to talk about mental health, and I'm glad that everyone's interested in mental health from one perspective to another. So I'll try to tailor some of the examples to some of the reasons that you cited for being here. So I just want to acknowledge where I am. I'm in downtown Toronto right now, right in the middle of the city. This is Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm here as a guest and visitor in this place, a long-time guest and visitor. I've lived and worked here for 17 years, raised my children here. So I'm very grateful to be walking on this land with the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. So Masi Cho to them. So I'm going to start with kind of giving a little bit of background on the context, because when we talk about anything to do with Indigenous health and specifically mental health, context is very important. Indigenous health is a very context-heavy topic. And that is because, you know, Indigenous people, as everyone here knows, lived for tens of thousands of years on these lands in harmony with the environment, sometimes in harmony with each other, but not always. And we're able to manage health and wellness in ways utilizing traditional knowledges. And that include a lot of land-based ways of being and doing. That all changed with first contact with Europeans, because contact brought not only the creation of North America, but it also brought to Turtle Island Indigenous people three things that specifically impacted the health and well-being of our people. And that was exposure to diseases and new foods, systemic disruption to community, and cross-cultural interactions. Because for the first time, we as Indigenous peoples, and of course there's a lot of within group differences among our many different tribes and nations, but it brought a real marked difference in culture, where we had to start to interact with people who were completely different from another paradigm to us. So these are the three ways that our well-being was impacted the most. So disruption to community, well, what does that really mean? Well, in Canada and America, Indigenous people have experienced multiple historical and current colonial aggressions and assaults. And these have really occurred through the system of education, which has been used as a tool of oppression through the creation of residential schools, and through child welfare, healthcare systems, and segregation, as well as the justice system, have also been sites of intensive and invasive personal harms to Indigenous people through these systems. Health services today continue to be a site of systemic and often personal oppression for Indigenous people all across Turtle Island. You know, in Canada, we call North America Turtle Island. I don't know if you call it that down there or not. Yes? No? Yeah, because, you know, different people in Canada have different stories about how the land was created. And one of the creation stories is that our land was created on the back of a turtle. So that's where Turtle Island comes from. That's what they call North America here. So when I say Turtle Island, I mean North America.
That's cool.
So, you know, these systemic policies are really what underpin the disruption to community. So in America, you know, Indigenous scholars have described, you know, federal Native American policy as being marked by sort of 6 phases of policies that really impacted people. You know, coexistence in the 1700s to early 1800s, policies around removal and reservations, then policies directly about assimilation, then policies around reorganization, termination, and then more recently around self-determination. And that's really from the work of Ned Blackhawk to understand the systemic disruptions. In Canada, we had one policy for Indigenous people, and that was the Indian Act. And the Indian Act has other similar policies in the US. And I'm not as familiar with the American ones specifically, because there were many different policies that happened there. In Canada, one policy was created, and that was created in order to allow the country, because Canada was created in 1876, the same time as this policy. And this policy had to be created in order to allow the country to be incorporated, because when the British and the French decided to make a country, they looked around, they're like, oh, there's already millions of people here, the Indians. We got to deal with them and get rid of them. So we're going to create this piece of legislation called the Indian Act, which had a sole purpose of eradicating the indigenous population to make way for unfettered access to lands and natural resources so that the country could be built. So, you know, this big piece of legislation had many federal policies and laws that if they weren't followed, they were punished by the justice system. So the objective was really about eradicating the population either through assimilation or death, and death through putting indigenous people in extreme situations of deprivation, like on reserves with no food or water, no health care, no education, no, all of the different things. And I know there are many policies in the US that were similar to this. So, you know, these are the many different policies of the Indian Act, all aimed at that one, you know, that one goal of eradicating the population through death or assimilation. And, you know, there were many things about it that were pretty horrific, but one of the most impactful policies of the Indian Act in Canada and the Indian policies in the US were the residential school policies. So a lot of people don't actually know really what residential school is. And it was an extensive school system that was set up in Canada by our federal government and in the US by the federal government there, and administered across the country in Canada, at least by churches. The primary objective of the schools was to remove and isolate children from their family homes and culture. And it was part of that assimilation policy. You know, in Canada, they didn't believe in just killing people directly. It was more like literally, you know, let people sort of be deprived of what they needed to live if they stayed on the reserve, or pluck them out of the reserve and civilize them in a colonial sense through residential schools or through placing them in foster homes, children, and then getting them to kind of assimilate into the general population. So there was a lot of archival footage of residential schools in Canada because the federal government actually believed that residential schools were very successful in their assimilation policy. And actually the whole Indian Act was seen as very successful internationally for its goal of assimilation and eradication of the policy. And it was so successful, in fact, that when the Dutch had colonized South Africa, they came to Canada and met with our federal government in the early 1900s to model the apartheid system on the Indian Act. That's how successful it was seen to be, and how celebrated it was by the colonial countries across the world. So I think one of the most important things about understanding of residential schools is, you know, the goal as it was written in the actual legislation was the goal of residential schools was to kill the Indian and the child. And that those were our federal laws. And those are based on that assumption that indigenous cultural beliefs and spirituality were inferior and unequal to Euro-Canadian Christian values and beliefs. So our country of Canada, for instance, because that's where I'm coming from, had very racist policies in place, and still does, because the Indian Act is still in full effect. They've just changed some of their policies. So for instance, residential school, the success of the residential school was celebrated throughout the country and around the world as a great way to, you know, eradicate the population. Here's a picture of the success. But the reality is it wasn't really successful or acceptable for Indigenous people to have to go through this. And because the United Nations brought international charges of human rights violation to the government of Canada on behalf of Indigenous children's family and adults who experienced residential school, our government was actually forced to to reconcile this harm it did to Indigenous people through the residential school experience. And our Prime Minister issued a formal apology to our people in 2008. And along with that apology came a plan for reconciliation of the harms that people had experienced, every person. So residential school was very widespread in Canada. Our data is very scant because the data just didn't exist. The federal government burned documents, destroyed them, hid them, locked them up. As a part of the, oh my God, my brain just completely shut off. As a part of the investigation by the World Health Organization, oh my God, my brain is just, this is what happens when you get old. You have a sip of water, I will remember what I was going to say.
Yeah. I don't know. You're doing pretty good considering if this is your brain off, I can't imagine what it's like when it's on.
Well, I'm an older lady now. I know I look young. I mean, I know I look like I'm 25, but
You really do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That kind of revitalized me.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the facts were very. No one really knew until about 2010 what some of the data was, because the government hid the data. And in fact, it's the United Nations. Sorry, the United Nations brought the human rights charges against Canada, found them guilty for the residential school. And then Canada had to go through this huge Indigenous reconciliation process, which you may have heard about in the news. They struck a commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the Indigenous Truth and Reconciliation, whose one task was to investigate the harms of residential school on Indigenous children, families, and communities. So from that research, which took 6 years to investigate, they came up with numbers like this, like that 150,000 children attended. Now, Indigenous communities believe these numbers are probably double or triple because there weren't real records kept, and also records were destroyed. So we believe this is an underestimation. And of course, over the last few years, when these mass graves of Indigenous children were found at residential school sites across Canada, everything that our communities knew was being verified and being there goes my brain again, being verified by these discoveries of mass graves that were, hidden and not talked about, because our communities knew that children went and then they just disappeared. Nobody knew where they were. And that happened in everybody's families, in my families, in his families, in her family. And that's a serious thing. So, and we know that many children died in many different ways, not just by disease. They died from malnutrition, drowning, exposure, abuse, assaults, all of these things. In the US, most Indian boarding schools, and you had a similar history with this, were closed by 2007. Our last residential school closed in 1996 in Canada, in 2007 in the US. And since that time, tribal control over schools has been supported by federal legislation and changing practices by the American Bureau of Indian Affairs. So there's also been a shift there, not this big Indigenous reconciliation shift that's changed a lot of things here, but things have also changed by the policy there, as we saw in those 6 phases of American Indian policy. In residential boarding schools in Canada and the US, we know that certain conditions that were all very harmful were present. That is a known fact. It's not a matter of opinion. This is what happened to students who attended these schools. And these schools resulted in individual, family, and community health impacts that were extremely negative. And it led to what's been called intergenerational harm and trauma, because people who attended schools failed to learn, proper parenting and coping skills. They were abused and learned to continue the cycle of the abuse. And many people who lost coping skills turned to drugs and alcohol to escape their ongoing torment, leading to, you know, child neglect, exposure to high-risk behaviors once they left residential school and became adults themselves. So it's been well substantiated in the literature that intergenerational trauma is a legacy of the Indian residential or boarding school. And intergenerational trauma occurs when an original trauma is passed down to subsequent generations through social, physiological, biological, environmental means. And, you know, the impact of that original trauma, anybody's original trauma is more sensitive to stressors in the environment. So if you had experienced a trauma as a child, or you grew up with someone who experienced trauma, then any stressor is going to make you more vulnerable to more traumas happening. So, so our research team created this really cool little sort of interactive diagram to kind of show what mediates intergenerational trauma. So when someone has something bad happen to them, a trauma is just something bad. You know, something bad happens, whether a tree falls on your car while you're in it, you get in a car accident, a tornado comes, you go to residential school. There's many different bad things that happen to people. Residential school is different because it happened based on a law and policy that says, because you're an Indian, you're going to go to this school, and these bad things are going to happen to you. That's different than something happening by a random accident or, you know, a bad choice you made or something. You know, this is called systemic trauma. There was a policy that said you're going to go through these bad experiences because of your race. So something bad happens. How that affects any individual is going to be based on what they experience in their immediate environment around them. So let's say you have something bad happens to you, you have a lot of supports. Well, you're probably going to be able to get over that traumatic experience pretty well. But if you don't have a lot of supports, you're not going to get over that experience pretty well. And then how you cope and manage with a traumatic experience is also based on the history of the group that you belong to, the social group, your family, your people, your community. And further to that, vulnerability in the presence of new stressors in the environment can make you more vulnerable to more traumas happening because you don't have the protective factors that you would have if you had never experienced a trauma. Risk for all kinds of problems can accumulate across generations when there's an unhealed original trauma. Unhealthy coping strategies are modeled intergenerationally. And historical events continue to undermine the well-being of the group. So examples of historical events that could do that could be the continued existence of colonial policies that harm people. It could also be things like the discovery of mass graves of children at residential schools sites now. The high profile harm to Indigenous people in social and political activism. You know, all these things are events that will undermine the well-being of the group because they poke at that original trauma. And then, of course, chronic exposures to ongoing group trauma, like racism, like oppression. You know, like I know I don't really think of myself as anything, but when I go walking around into stores or especially in healthcare settings, I get targeted a lot. When I leave the downtown, it's a city. There's 6 million people here. Nobody cares if you're brown, yellow, blue, purple, gray. But as soon as I get out of the downtown into a small town or somewhere, I get a lot of racist treatment right to my face. You know, I'm watching you. You know, like, who's your worker? What are you stealing? Why are you falling? You know, all these kind of things. And, you know, those also can those exacerbate original traumas and help pass on the intergenerational trauma. Because let's say I'm somewhere with my kids. Well, my kids are grown now, but even if I'm with them, you know, and something happens to me, I get some kind of racist experience. And then that kind of triggers, you know, whatever's happened to me as an Indigenous person, that's going to get transferred on to my kids, right? Because they're there. And suddenly, you know, they're acting in different ways because now they're feeling targeted because their mom is targeted. So these are just examples. And I'm sure you all have many examples where you can see how this fits in with what you know or what you've seen or what your experiences are. So in the Indigenous reconciliation process of Canada, the federal government was forced, because it was found guilty and it had to come up with this reconciliation process. It decided it was going to have a process for all survivors of residential school across Canada. So those are my parents. So both went to residential school. All my younger siblings went. I didn't go because I was moved to a city. I was hidden so that I wouldn't go to residential school. I was lucky that way. But everyone in my family, including my baby brother and sister, went to residential school. So the government decided, well, you know, we're going to make reconciliation with everyone. We're going to invite them to fill out this, you know, 80-page form that says, you know, this is who I am. These are the schools I went to. This is the abuse I experienced. These are the harms I suffered and the treatments I got afterwards. Here's my subsequent education and work history, and here's what I'm going to do going forward. And then they would have the survivor sit with Canada's lawyer, like the federal government's lawyer, their own lawyer. The survivor would get a lawyer appointed, and then an elder and a support person were allowed to be in the room, and the person would have to read through this whole document. So you can imagine that that would bring up a lot of trauma, right? Because, so for instance, this is my mom's document. She went to residential school for 12 years. These are the years she went to residential school. And she had never spoken about any of the stuff that happened because the priests and the nuns told all the students, never talk about anything. You're not allowed to talk about anything. And suddenly, in the federal reconciliation process, all these survivors are being told to talk about their experience so that the government could say, yeah, this happened to you. We agree. We're sorry. Here's $100,000 or here's $200,000 or whatever. And then they've done their bit. They've done their reconciliation, and then the government's moved on. But for our people, going through this reconciliation process actually just opened up that wound and that trauma for people who had shut it down. You know, with the generation before me and my generation, you know, we're that generation who really went through a lot, right? And have had no coping from the system, right? Because we had everything taken away and nothing there for us. So this is what reconciliations look like in Canada. So where are we now? You know, well, you know, the legacy of colonization has really left us with what the system calls the social determinants of health. So, you know, as a result of this colonial history, the residential schools, the forced land relocation to Indian reserves. That's a big part of America's history, where Indigenous people, Native Americans, were forcibly moved from all over the US to certain places like the Southwest, like the Northeast. You know, this displacement and these assimilation policies that had real impact have left Indigenous people across North America to be people who have the poorest health levels in the country. And that's because the policies took away our health, our mental health, our physical health, not because of a biological or individual process that has caused us to be unwell. It's the federal policies that have caused our health to be as poor as it is. So in Canada, it's been, you know, the public health and the healthcare system say that the determinants of Indigenous people's health are, if you're poor, if you went to residential school, that you didn't finish school, that you have substance abuse, unemployment, dependence on social assistance, water problems, no food, environmental contaminants, being in jail, bad housing, homeless, all these things. This is how Indigenous people's health is defined in Canada. Indigenous people have a definition of health as being the balance within and between those four sacred aspects of the self: the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional. We define health as that sacred balance between the four aspects of the self. The biomedical model of health defines health as the absence of disease. What are some of the challenges of Indigenous mental health across, Turtle Island, across North America? Well, as I said earlier, it's been documented that our people are in crisis. So, for example, here's some data from the First Nations Regional Health Survey that shows that most Indigenous people have higher rates of moderate or high levels of psychological distress that they report, 50% versus 33% of the general population. And that 22% of Indigenous people living on reserves report suicidal ideation at some point, compared to 9% of the general population. So there's a significance there of people, of First Nations people living on reserve. That's what we call our American Indians here, First Nations on reserve. Another bit of data shows that for First Nations people, they have higher levels of stressors like death of a family member, serious illness. So this is the Indigenous people, the dark one, and the lighter one. I don't think it was meant to be that way, and the lighter one are non-Indigenous people, higher rates. And so when we look at things like not being able to get a job, now that's more than double. This is more than triple. Alcohol-related problems, mental illness, trouble with police, non-Indigenous people, less than 5% of the population, gambling problems. So, we have higher stressors as Indigenous people, according to the data. Now, just one thing that's important to say. So this is just some demographic data that shows the Indigenous population in the province of Saskatchewan. So what the province of Saskatchewan says is that 33% of its Indigenous population, live on a First Nation reserve, and 77% live off reserve, just in the province of Saskatchewan. So we know that data in Canada, and I know it's the same in the US, higher in fact. In Canada, across the whole country, about 70% of our Indigenous population lives off reserve. However, all of our health data is based on reserve population data, because there's no way to capture the health data, the mental health or health data of Indigenous people off reserve, because they're off reserve. They're anywhere. You can't find them. People don't self-identify in healthcare systems because of discrimination and racism. So the data that we have that shows that Indigenous people are in a health crisis, both in Canada and the US, may be quite suspect because it's not capturing the data. So I was just in Los Angeles a few months ago. I was meeting with some Indigenous colleagues at UCLA, and I want to look to see how many Indigenous people are in Los Angeles. There's 2 million Indigenous Native American people in the county of LA. Now that's more than in the whole country of Canada, but I'm just saying those people do not all live on a reserve. They do not live on a First Nations reservation. Their data is not captured in that. So we don't really know what the health status is of people, because the data is not a representative sample of the population. So we have to be very careful when we look at this data and say, yeah, everyone's committing suicide, everyone's in a health crisis. Well, on reserves, yes, because they're living in a state of deprivation on most reserves. Not all reserves, but most reserves in Canada for sure. And I've been to a few reserves in the US, and they're all vastly different. So I don't know what the data says there, but I know that our data that says First Nations are this or that are based on reserves, which don't represent 77% of the population. So that's very important to be aware of that. A second big issue is that there are challenges to the mental health system for Indigenous people. Apart from the data saying we're in a crisis is faulty, there's challenges. And challenges are really about access to mental health services. So on reserves, for instance, there's small pockets of healthcare. If people need to leave reserves for mental health crisis intervention, they have to travel. They get to a city where they go to a mental hospital. You know, there's no therapists, psychologists, or psychiatrists on reserves. If they have a breakdown, they have to get transported to a city. So that's a bit of a problem. In cities, the other issue is to do with also access, because there's a lack of culturally competent care for Indigenous people. And when it comes to access to healthcare in general, we had a very famous case in Canada of this gentleman, Caleb McKay, who actually ended up dying outside of his community because he didn't have access to the healthcare he needed. And when he got to it, it was too late and he died. And it was something routine. He would have been fine if he could have just got what he needed in his community. Racism is the other big issue about access to healthcare in general and mental health in particular. So data around mental health services show that most Indigenous youth and adults do not attend mental health counseling or interventions after the first session because of the racism that they experience in session due to the cross-cultural incompetence or lack of cultural safety of a treatment program, of a specific worker. And on a broader level, these have real serious implications because people die when they experience racist treatment in the healthcare system. So we had a case here 2 years ago where an Indigenous woman died in the hospital because the nurses were making fun of her and calling her racist names while she was in screaming pain, instead of actually giving her the help she needed. It's really, really sad. And these kind of things happen very commonly in Canada. Discrimination is another problem with how healthcare is practiced. So for instance, how can you be mentally healthy when you've only had access to tainted water for months or years in your community? And there are communities in Canada who've had undrinkable water for 10, 20 years, and it continues to be that way. Another big issue is that non-Indigenous health practices are really what's mainly only available for Indigenous people. So for instance, Indigenous health would never be practiced in isolation like this, with the woman alone, away from her community, away from her family, not even actually accessing a healthcare provider in person, but about to do it on a video screen. Indigenous healing and medicine are not readily available or widely available for Indigenous people seeking health or mental health treatments. We have medicines that have been used for centuries to appropriately and successfully deal with mental health and healthcare needs and issues for people. And Indigenous control over healthcare systems, including mental health, are also an issue. Hang on a second. Sorry, there's just someone at the door. Janae, Gabby's at the door and I'm doing my webinar. Can you deal with it, please? Yeah. Thanks. Sorry. So in Canada, in a few small areas, our communities have been able to take control over the healthcare systems and been able to create appropriate mental health services. So in British Columbia, the First Nation Health Authority has asserted Indigenous autonomy and control. In Ontario, there have been a few different pockets, but by and large, this is more of an exception than the rule. So where am I going with all this? Well, Indigenous mental health is really about healing and reclamation of our traditional ways of being. The first is really about understanding that our mental health has to be determined by our communities and our people. And the second part is about, well, what does reconciliation really mean and what is this about? So, you know, a few slides back, I said what the determinants of health were from a Western healthcare perspective. In our research, we've developed Indigenous determinants of health. So these are things that our people need to be healthy. So what our research has shown over the last 10 years is that for our people to be mentally and physically well, we need to be around elders and traditional knowledges. We need to have our Indigenous languages as part of our lives. We need to have access to being on the land. We need to have traditional foods. We need to be in community. We need to be doing our spiritual ceremonies. We need to have love and relationships in our lives. Hang on, can you guys just be quiet for 10 minutes? Then I'll be done. Thank you. Sorry. And we need to be able to be recovering from colonial trauma, to have the resources and supports to do that. So worldwide, what this looks like is that there is legislation at an international level through the United Nations. So they've developed a policy document called, we call it UNDRIP for short, but it's the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And this provides a framework for reconciliation, healing, and peace, as well as harmonious and cooperative relations, about human rights and non-discrimination for our people. So this is a really important document. So whenever I go to create a research project on Indigenous mental health, to create an intervention program or a healing program, I turn to UNDRIP and I preface it by saying, here's the rationale for why we need to do this, because it's been declared internationally that we need to address Indigenous mental health from an Indigenous perspective, that we need to undo the harms of colonialism. That's what this declaration gives us, that the traction to be able to do that, because most people in the world don't care about Indigenous health and wellness. They don't think it's relevant. Oh, that's outdated. That's not important. You don't need to do that. Well, actually, we do. And the United Nations has actually got a policy document that says why we do and why we need to do it, and why you as a local, state, or a federal government need to, give us the funds that we need to do this, because it's an international human rights issue. In Canada, we have a document like this too, and that came from that Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 6-year investigation into the current and historic impacts of the residential school system on the lives of individuals and communities. And that was called the TRC, short for Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So this was a big report, and you can Google it. If you just Google Canada TRC report, it has a big report that says, these are the 4 areas that were most impacted by the residential school experience. And then it came up with 94 concrete recommendations or calls to action on how people in these 4 systems and how all people in Canada can engage in reconciliation of the harms of colonization on people's well-being, especially their mental health. So in the US, well, I really did my research to see But really, the lasting legacy of the boarding school policies in the US has been ignored systemically by federal and state governments. September 30th has been named as National Day of Remembrance for Native American children that honors those who died. But I don't see anything that the federal government in the US is doing to initiate reconciliation or suggested reparations of the harms for the many students and their families who went through this traumatic experience. So, why is it up to Americans and Canadians to take action regarding reconciliation of colonization? Meaning, that residential schools happened, that there were, child welfare assimilations, that healthcare harms people, that people are put on reserves with our people. Why is it up to Americans and Canadians to reconcile these harms of the impacts of all these things on our mental health? Does anyone want to take a crack at answering this question? There's many reasons why it's up to non-Indigenous people to take action in terms of reconciling Indigenous colonization.
We created the problem, right?
That is true. Yeah, that's true.
It's the right thing to do, and it's in everyone's best interest.
It's the moral, it's the moral thing. That's a good answer too. Anyone else? Those are all true. Those are all good reasons. Absolutely.
I don't think reconciliation can occur unless both sides of the equation are aware and working, taking action.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's true. Those are all good reasons. And, there is also another reason, and that is that when these federal Indian policies were created in Canada and in America to, that put our children in these schools, that tore apart our families and communities, that put us on reserves, that did all these things, took away our well-being. It did have a big impact on us personally, obviously, because it created the trauma, which became intergenerational, which crippled us, right? Mentally, emotionally, physically. That's what makes Indigenous mental health different from mental health problems of other people's, because our problems come directly from systemic oppressions. It happened because a law said we had to go through these experiences of residential school. So it was systemic and it impacted us greatly. But residential school policies and assimilation policies actually had a greater impact on non-Indigenous people, because once we were out of the way, it gave them the land, the resources to build their communities, their towns, their homes, their cities, and their country. So every non-Indigenous person's existence in North America comes directly on the harms perpetrated on Indigenous people. Because without residential school, without forced land relocation to reserves, without the taking away of all the human rights of Indigenous people, the immigrants, meaning the British, the French, the Europeans, the people who came here would not have had the country to build their homes. And all of the people who are currently living here would not be benefiting from the harms perpetrated on Indigenous people. And whether you came here 5 generations ago or you came here 5 days ago, you're benefiting from the harms perpetrated on Indigenous people, because those are what allowed you to have your city, your town, your infrastructure, your bank, your school, your electricity, your homes, because without that, you wouldn't have them. And that's why it's up to non-Indigenous people to take action regarding Indigenous reconciliation. So basically, reconciliation really means that all people involved, meaning everyone who lives in a colonial place, needs to take responsibility for either healing their own wounds. I'm a wounded person because of residential school. because of all the Indian Act policies. I have to take responsibility for my healing. I need to deal with my trauma and my pain. I can't point the finger, oh, it's the government's fault. Oh, it's the white man's fault. It's the church's fault. It's the priest's fault. Yeah, they did all those things, but I'm an adult and I'm wounded and I got to take care of my healing. Everyone else who is not Indigenous has to take responsibility for the harm that has been perpetrated and continues to be perpetrated through the systems that continue to practice in colonial and racist ways to harm people. So Indigenous individuals, communities, we need to take responsibility for our healing. Everyone else needs to stop perpetrating colonial harm through mental health, through education, through the justice system, through anything. Whatever you do in society, stop harming Native people through it. How do you stop harming? Well, remember, access is a problem. Racism is a problem. A friend of mine who runs a ballet company, this really great lady, she's German. She came here 2 years ago. She started a ballet company and she takes reconciliation seriously. And she says, Suzanne, what can I do? And I said, well, you run a ballet school. She's like, yeah. I'm like, well, you could make registration for all Indigenous students free. And then you could make a position and hire only an Indigenous person. You say, I'm only hiring an Indigenous person for this job. And Indigenous students can come here for free and take ballet classes. That's how someone who doesn't work in any of these things, just what they do, can enact reconciliation, because they're giving access, they're reducing racism, they're making it inclusive. They're doing all these things. That's reconciliation right there. It doesn't have to be about education. It doesn't have to be about healthcare. If you're a garbage man, if you're a stay-at-home parent, if you're, a lawnmower, if you're anything, there's a way to stop harming Indigenous people through what you do on the daily, whatever that is. So people are always asking me, what do you think about reconciliation of colonization? And, we have UNDRIP, we have the TRC report. There's other documents worldwide. These reports may disappear. They've had a lot of traction, both the TRC and the UNDRIP document. But these issues that I've talked about here that affect our mental wellness, they're not going to go away. But even if these reports stop having traction, these policy documents that I've cited to you, UNDRIP, TRC, the research, these are really great tools to help to, educate and inform people so that we can start talking about more solutions nationally and internationally. People are always asking me, what is it that Native people want from us? That's what the white people are always saying. I'm like, you know what? That TRC report that I talked about, it has 94 calls to action about what to do to enact reconciliation. It tells people in concrete terms, this is how you can stop hurting us. And it's really up to everyone to take action. Indigenous people, we're taking responsibility for our own healing. What is everyone else who's not Indigenous doing to stop the harms? So, any questions or comments?
One of the things that I have seen, maya ko nga, irusa ka ko nga, kipaklo ka ko nga, kagana ka ko nga, pangya ka ko nga, alak na kami nga, quickpag mi nga. My name is Valerie, and one of the things that I've seen is our cosmology, our positionality in this world needs to be said, needs to be talked about as a step, as the basis for any discussion. Because with that comes a ceremony first. And so it puts you in the right space. It puts you in the right perspective, which of course is what my mom would always say, is your perspective is everything. It'll keep your mind intact. It'll help to keep your mind intact. I appreciate you sharing with us, Koyana. Thank you.
Big witch, thank you. That's beautiful. Yes. And I work in a research unit, and of course I do clinical practice as a psychologist, but all of our research, we're probably the first research unit in Canada that grounds everything we do in ceremony. We have 5 elders in residence. We do Sundance every summer. We do fasting spring and fall for all of our students and staff in our Masters in Health program. We do sweats every couple of weeks all year long. We do ceremonies where elders want us to do. We've really grounded our research in ceremony, like literally we do ceremony every day almost, even with our daily smudge and daily prayers and openings and closings. And it makes a difference. It changes everything because, that's what we call the X factor, Spirit comes in and everything's changed. And no matter how hard the policies tried to take spirit away, it doesn't go away. So thank you. I appreciate that. And this is just, these are the strong women behind me and ahead of me. That's my mom on the left, and that's my daughter on the right. I have 4 kids, but that's my youngest daughter on the right, and my mom. And you can see the strength of that spirit in our women. We're strong. We have that spirit and that strength inside of us.
So Dr. Stewart, we did have one question in the chat. Do you have any resources about the connection between environmental racism and Indigenous mental health?
There's a lot of research about that. And I would go, especially I would look at the Our Health Counts data. If you just Google Our Health Counts research, it would come up on Google. It's pretty out there. There's a lot. They have a lot of fact sheets that they've printed off, as well as articles that they've published around the connection between racism and health and mental health.
Any other questions or comments?
There's my cell phone and my email. If after this you think of something you want to put in writing, or you want to text me or call me, I'm always open and here to help or listen in any way I can.
Well, Dr. Stewart, we are so appreciative of your time. This was very informative. I know for myself, I have not heard of Indigenous determinants of health, so that was new for me, and I think that's really important for me to learn and incorporate in. And then the reconciliation, I think, that is a huge wake-up call, and we really need to do more to make up for what we've done. As Dr. Stewart mentioned, if you have questions, comments, feel free to reach out to her. You can reach out to me, and I'm happy to get you connected. As mentioned at the beginning of the session today, this is our last one for 2023, but more to come in 2024. So continue to look out for information about the AIHEC Health webinar series. And again, a huge thank you to you, Dr. Stewart. We are so appreciative of your time and your talent. And to everyone else, thank you and enjoy your day.
Miigwech, Masicho, it's so grateful to be here. Please keep in touch with me. Send me an email if you need me to do anything. I'm always there to help. Anything that anybody wants, I don't really ever say no when I'm asked to help with something. So, miigwech.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.